A History of English Literature from Earliest Times to 1916 by Arthur Compton-Rickett, narrated by Anita Saran. The Middle English Period, 1066 to 1400. Introduction. Medieval Scholarship and the Latin Writers, Chronicles and Histories. Latin was a language in which the cultured man of Norman times wrote, and French was a language spoken in polite society. The Saxon tongue languished, and there is little doubt that the Norman conquest did for a time militate against the development of our literature. Many Saxons wrote in French, and with the exception of the Saxon Chronicle, which went on until 1154, the bulk of the prose was written in Latin. English prose after the Chronicle practically slumbered until its remarkable awakening in the 16th century. Yet, after all, the Norman conquest was not the conquest of England by an alien race. The Normans were originally Northmen like the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, even though southern influences had greatly modified their character and outlook. And this affinity was ultimately felt by both Saxon and Norman. Consequently, there was a real fusion of the two races. On the Saxon side, we accepted the traditions of France in matters poetical. On the Norman side, we finally chose the Saxon tongue in place of the French in which to express ourselves. Medieval Scholarship and the Latin Writers, Chronicles and Histories. Scholarship, even before the conquest, had formed many links with the continent. There was an exchange of students between the universities of Oxford and Paris, Oxford being then in its infancy. French and Flemish ecclesiastics came to England, and Englishmen finished their training in French or Flemish monasteries. This intercourse received a powerful impetus with Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury. A rich, learned ecclesiastical literature in Latin soon arose in England. There were many scholars who came to fill livings and stations of honor in the newly founded monasteries. They were far superior in many cases to the English clergy in their knowledge of the Latin writers and in their style. The interests of the clergy were not confined to biblical and theological subjects. The monasteries were great centers of hospitality, and they entertained important statesmen and distinguished travelers. The abbots and monks, often scholarly, cultured men, took an interest in worldly affairs and in the statecraft of the age. Hence, it is that the most important contribution to literature made by the Latin writers is the series of chronicles in which the chief aim of the writers was to give a faithful record of contemporary events. Many of these records breathe the charm of a personal narrative, and though composed in a foreign tongue, are written from a national point of view. Before dealing with the chroniclers, we may just briefly glance at the theological work of Lanfranc and Anselm and other churchmen, which precluded the establishment of a more national literature. Lanfranc wrote about 1080 a book defending the doctrine of transubstantiation called the Liber Scintillarum. Anselm, who died in 1100, wrote a number of theological tracts and treatises. Osborne of Gloucester, 1150, wrote a commentary on the Pentateuch and the Book of Judges. He also translated some lives of the native saints from early English into Latin. Robert Pullis, who lectured at Oxford, compiled a manual of theology entitled Libri Sententarium. Other writers who labored in this field were Hugo of Rouen, who died in 1164, Robert de Millen, who died 1167, whose speculations were embodied in his Summa Sententarium. In addition to these purely technical theological works, there was also a mass of literature dealing with the lives of the saints, especially Irish and Welsh saints. A number of English saints were deposed by the more orthodox Normans. The work of Alfred or Ethelred of Rievaulx is distinguished for its spirit of mysticism. There is in it the same note of subjective religious intensity that is found later on in the works of Richard Rolle. Alfred wrote the Speculum Charitatis, or the Dialogue de Spirituali Amicitia, a rule for nuns, Liber de Institutione Inclusarum, 33 homilies, a chronicle of the reign of Stephen, in which he describes the Battle of the Standard. He died in 1166 and 25 years later was canonized as a saint. Nor was the secular side of knowledge neglected by these Latin writers. Adelard of Bath studied at Tours and Laon and afterwards lectured at Laon, from whence he travelled eastward, visiting Greece and Asia Minor, possibly even penetrating to Baghdad. On his return home, by his lectures and translations of mathematical and astronomical works, he rendered the more advanced learning of the Arabs accessible to the West. Adelard had a passionate love of scientific knowledge and claimed the rights of reason as opposed to blind faith in authority. In his Quaestionuca Naturale, he discusses with his nephew, who represents Western learning, having been trained at Laon, 67 questions or problems in physical science. Adelard gives solutions according to the knowledge he has gained in the East, the nephew answering them according to the wisdom of the West. Adelard also wrote a treatise on the abacus and the astrolabe. He translated an Arabic work on astronomy and introduced into England the first translations of Euclid. The latter remained a textbook for generations. His treatise, De Codum et Diverso, the same and different, published before 1116, consists of a dialogue between philosophy, love of wisdom, and philokosmia, love of the world. These, under the guise of two women, appeared to him when he was a student on the banks of the Loire. They dispute as to which of them shall have most claim to his affection. He finally chooses philosophy. The treatise is an allegorical expression of his passion for learning. In 1140, Robert de Retinis, an Anglo-Norman, and his friend Dalmatian Hermann went to Evora in Spain in order to study under Arab teachers. During this period, Robert, at the desire of Peter the Venerable, Abbot of Cluny, produced a translation of the Quran. Alexander Neckham, 1157–1217, was born and educated at St. Albans, afterwards taught at Paris, wrote a treatise on science in Latin elegiac verse, in which he deals with creation, the elements, fire, water, air, and the 7 arts, a number of other prose works, and a commentary on Aristotle. A number of Latin poems also belong to this period. Reginald of Canterbury, 1120, wrote a long poem on the legend of St. Malchus, a poem rendered somewhat tedious by its rhymed hexameters. He is, however, the author of a charming song of praise to his home in southern France, Fagia. Lawrence of Durham, in the middle of the 12th century, in his Hypognosticon, tells the Bible history in Latin verse. His Consolation pro morte amici, modelled on Boethius, combines prose and rhythm in an artistic manner. Henry of Huntington, better known as an historian, also distinguished himself in various forms of Latin verse. The historical writers are, however, by far the most important both in bulk and consequence. Many causes contributed to the outbursts of historic writing which occurs at this time. Under Henry I, England and Normandy were united and England assumed the dominant position. The Normans who settled England adopted it as their country. Hence, the national character of works written by Anglo-Normans in an alien tongue. The Crusades, moreover, were exercising the same sort of stimulus as that afforded in later time by the discovery of the New World. Men's minds were enlarged by new geographical knowledge, by the interchange of stories and romances. The wonder of the East gave to the more prosaic Western mind an element of magic to ponder over. The chroniclers, however, were for the most part sober-minded historians. Geoffrey of Monmouth forms a notable exception, who desired to set down the truth as they knew it. For the earlier part of their chronicles, they incorporated the work of previous writers, but in their contemporary records they write of things they have seen or heard related, and in many instances they have been in personal contact with the warriors and statesmen. They have handled the documents to describe, hence the value of the records. From Bede onwards, the monasteries had maintained a tradition of chronicle writing. Many of the monasteries had rooms set apart for the writing and copying of old books. Two chief schools arose, one in the north, the Northumbrian, and one in the south, at St. Albans. The former has been characterized as the most ancient, the most fertile, longest lived, and most widely spread. The first writer of this school to merit mention is Simeon, precentor of Durham. Simeon's work is based on Bede up till the 9th century, when he follows a Northumbrian chronicle that has been lost and is now known to us only through Simeon's chronicle. He then follows Florence of Worcester from 1121 to 9. The latter part of the work is the writer's own contribution. This may be cited as an example of the method adopted by the majority of the chroniclers. This work of Simeon's attained high repute and was continued down to the reign of King Stephen by two priors of Hexham, the elder of whom, Richard, wrote an account of the acts of Stephen and the Battle of the Standard. William of Newburgh, 1136 to 1208, who has been styled the father of historical criticism, would almost certainly have been involved in a libel action had he lived in those days. His acuteness led him to describe Geoffrey of Monmouth's work as a tissue of lies. William limits himself to dealing with the events of his own times. He declares that in our own times such great and memorable events have happened that the negligence of moderns would justly be reprehended should they fail to hand them to eternal memory in literary monuments. Roger of Hoveden, who also belongs to the Northern School, wrote a history of several centuries compiled from various sources. In the next chapter, we will cover the Southern School. Thank you for listening.